In 1811, the United States did something very American. It looked at a system that was working, argued about it for years, and then dismantled it anyway, by a single vote. The first bank of the United States, the institution that had stabilized the country's currency, restored its credit, and quietly held the financial system together, was allowed to die. There was no replacement, no transition plan, and no backup system. It was simply gone. Jefferson's vision had finally defeated Hamilton's. The centralized financial machine was dismantled, and the republic was, once again, free from a powerful national bank. For a brief moment, that victory felt righteous. Then the system started to come apart. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines. That's the danger of removing infrastructure. It doesn't explode, it decays. When the bank's charter expired, its doors didn't slam shut in panic. Markets still opened, merchants still traded, notes still changed hands. At first, most people didn't notice anything wrong, and that's important, because systems rarely fail in ways that feel urgent at the beginning. They fail through friction. A bill that used to clear in days now took weeks. A banknote that was accepted last year suddenly needed a second look. A lender hesitated, not because something was broken, but because something was missing. There were no breadlines, no runs in the street, no dramatic collapse, just inconvenience. And inconvenience rarely triggers reform. The first bank had acted as a stabilizer, not by dominating the economy, but by disciplining it. It accepted government deposits, issued reliable notes, demanded that state banks settle balances in hard money, and pulled excess paper out of circulation when things got loose. Without it, those guardrails vanished overnight. State banks rushed in to fill the vacuum, and they did what banks tend to do when nobody is watching. They expanded, rapidly. Across the country, banks began issuing their own notes again. Some were responsibly backed, many were not. Each state drifted back toward its own monetary orbit. Paper currency multiplied, standards eroded, credit quality declined. Imagine running a dry goods store in 1813. By noon, you've accepted 3 different banknotes, each issued by a different bank in a different state. All of them look legitimate. All of them promise redemption. None of them are guaranteed. By evening, you're not sure which ones will still be honored tomorrow. So you raise prices, not because you want to, but because uncertainty always charges interest. Merchants once again discounted unfamiliar notes. Farmers struggled to know what their money was actually worth, and confidence, the invisible glue of any financial system, began to fray. This still wasn't collapse. It was drift. To understand why this mattered, you have to pause the timeline for a moment. What the United States lost in 1811 was not authority. It was coordination. The federal government still had the legal right to tax, the authority to borrow, and the power to issue debt. What it no longer had was a system that made those powers work smoothly. Money stopped moving as a single network and started behaving like a collection of local weather patterns. Some regions had credit, others didn't. Some banks cooperated, others pulled inward. Nothing was illegal, and nothing was dramatic, but nothing was synchronized. And in a financial system, synchronization is everything. Coordination allows risk to be shared. Fragmentation forces risk to pile up in the wrong places. Without a central institution enforcing standards, every transaction became slightly more cautious. Every loan carried a little more uncertainty, and every promise required a little more trust. And trust, once strained, does not rebound quickly. The system didn't feel weaker. It felt slower, less reliable, more hesitant. That's how structural decay hides, not in collapse, but in latency. Foreign lenders noticed almost immediately. During the first bank's existence, the United States had begun to look credible, predictable, boring even, which is exactly what lenders like. After 1811, that credibility slipped. Borrowing costs rose, access to capital tightened, and the federal government found it harder to finance even routine operations. At the time, many Americans believed this was temporary, a transition period, a necessary discomfort on the way to something freer and more decentralized. They didn't know yet that they were watching the opening act of a pattern that would repeat for nearly a century. Then, in 1812, America picked an especially inconvenient moment to go to war. The War of 1812 exposed just how much the first bank had been doing behind the scenes. Wars are expensive. They require borrowing, coordination, and confidence that the government issuing debt will still exist when the bill comes due. Without a national bank, the Treasury scrambled. Bond auctions struggled. Interest rates climbed. Some banks refused federal paper outright, not out of rebellion, but out of fear. Without a central institution backing them, government promises suddenly looked optional. Payments to soldiers were delayed. Supplies were harder to secure. Regional banks favored regional interests. At one point, the federal government couldn't even borrow enough to keep itself operating smoothly. Picture the Treasury during those years. Clerks working through ledgers that no longer lined up, revenues arriving unevenly, payments delayed not because Congress refused, but because the system itself hesitated. Borrowing depended on which bank you asked, and where it was located. The federal government didn't lose authority overnight. It lost coordination, and in a financial system, coordination is power. The irony was hard to miss. The country had dismantled its financial backbone and then immediately needed it. Hamilton had warned that a nation without stable credit would be vulnerable in a crisis. Jefferson had insisted decentralization was safer. Reality voted. And it did not vote unanimously. We can't know for certain what would have happened if the first bank had survived. History doesn't offer control groups. But we can look at what the system was designed to do and what disappeared when it was removed. With a national bank in place, war borrowing would likely have been centralized, interest rates more stable, federal debt more uniform, and state banks more constrained. Instead of negotiating with dozens of institutions, the Treasury would have had a single financial counterparty. Instead of regional fragmentation, the country would have presented a unified credit front. Would that have made the War of 1812 easier? Maybe not militarily, but financially, almost certainly. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the United States would later rebuild this exact architecture, twice. Once with the second bank, and again with the Federal Reserve. The structure Hamilton built never truly disappeared. It went underground. And every time the country faced stress, it resurfaced, because the problem it solved never went away. Here's the part that often gets lost. Jefferson and his allies weren't inventing a cartoon villain. They had just escaped an empire where a central government and a national bank could finance wars, steer policy, and outlast elections. And Hamilton's blueprint borrowed openly from the Bank of England. To Jefferson, that wasn't stability. It was the ghost of the thing they'd just fled, putting on a new coat. Those fears weren't irrational, but dismantling a system without replacing its function turned out to be far riskier than leaving it in place. Jefferson feared centralized finance would concentrate power. What he didn't anticipate was that the absence of coordination would concentrate chaos instead. Power didn't disappear. It moved. Unevenly, unpredictably, and without accountability. By 1815, the debate was no longer philosophical. It was practical. Even James Madison, once a vocal opponent of the bank, had changed his mind. Not because he loved centralized finance, but because the alternative had proven worse. In private at first, and then publicly, he acknowledged that the country needed a national financial institution. Not because it was elegant or perfect, but because the system could not survive without one. The shift was quiet, but decisive. Congress began discussing a new bank, not as a bold innovation, but as a reluctant necessity. The language changed. No longer, should we have a national bank? Now it was, how do we function without one? Hamilton had been dead for years by this point, but his arguments were suddenly everywhere. In 1816, just 5 years after killing the first bank, Congress chartered its replacement, the Second Bank of the United States. Bigger, more powerful, more explicitly national. America had dismantled the system, suffered the consequences, and rebuilt it anyway. Only this time, the stakes were higher. The creation of the second bank wasn't a victory lap. It was an admission that decentralization alone couldn't support a growing, industrializing nation, that credit required coordination, and that money required architecture. Ignoring those realities carried a cost, but rebuilding the bank didn't end the money wars. It escalated them, because the second bank inherited more than the first bank's functions. It inherited its enemies: suspicion, resentment, regional hostility, and populist anger. And in the decades that followed, those tensions would coalesce around a man who made Jefferson look cautious. A man who didn't just distrust the bank, but took its existence personally. Andrew Jackson. The collapse of the first bank didn't settle the argument over who should control America's money. It proved that the argument couldn't be avoided. And by rebuilding the system they had just destroyed, Americans set the stage for the most explosive chapter yet in the money wars. That's next. This is Money Margins. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.